Hi there. Eileen, Frank, and I have given this workshop a couple of times on adapting your teaching to AI generator tools like ChatGPT, and it's been pretty popular, but some people couldn't make it, so I thought I would record a version of what we talked about during the session for those who might be interested. We'll be talking about these AI generator tools that have really emerged in the last 6 months or so, and from the point of view of an instructor. We'll talk about some of the basics of these tools, what they are, and then talk about some educational examples, again, mostly from an instructor point of view. Then briefly go through some of the major issues and limitations with these kinds of tools, and then have share some concrete strategies for adapting your assessments and assignments. And then at the end, talk a little bit about future tool trends with these tools. One thing I do want to mention though is you can access most of the essential resources that we'll talk about in the session at this link, bit.ly or bit.ly/teach ChatGPT. That will take you to this handout that covers 5 strategies for adapting your assessments that I'll go into in a bit, some do's and don'ts when using these kinds of tools. For example, we recommend creating a course policy maybe in your syllabus, and here's a link to some sample course policies. At the top of the handout are links to some other resources, including the slides you're about to see. I'm going to add a link to this video and this LibGuide. That's what Eileen Frank created, our librarian, and has many other resources about these artificial intelligence tools and some of the issues related to them. Okay, so just to get into some of the basics first, there are many different types of these artificial intelligence generation tools or generative AI tools. The main one we'll talk about today are the kinds of tools that can generate text. ChatGPT is the most popular one, but there's also Bing Chat, which uses the new version of ChatGPT under the hood. And then there's Google Bard. Just to let you know from my test and from maybe some others, the best free option right now might be Bing Chat. I'm also keeping an eye on some emerging open source and free options that are maybe more ethically trained, and some you can even download and run locally on your computer so you don't have to worry about privacy issues. There's also image generator tools. Stable Diffusion was my favorite for a while, but it does have copyright issues. It was trained on copyrighted images, and now they're being sued because of that reason. Midjourney version 5 just came out. It's probably the highest quality tool, but you have to pay to be a member to use the newest version. The version 4 is free. DALL-E is used under the hood by the Bing image generator, so it also might be the best free option I might recommend at the moment. I just got access to Adobe Firefly yesterday. It's trained on images that don't have the copyright images, so you don't have to worry about that. But in my initial tests, it's maybe not quite as good as some of these other tools yet. There's also tools that can generate code, and ChatGPT and Bing Chat can also generate code. There's tools that generate music or videos or even 3D scenes. For a more complete list of all these different artificial intelligence tools that are emerging, there's one site that you might check out called futurepedia.io. At the moment, it lists over 1,700 different tools. And if you search education, you'll see they have a whole category of tools that are tagged as being connected to education that might be useful. My only caveat, or warning is that many of these tools are really just thin wrappers on top of ChatGPT or other tools. So, and they may ask you to pay money. Like some of these have a monthly fee or they have a free tier and then they have a pay tier. And in several cases, you don't really need to pay for them unless you're maybe find them really useful and want to be a heavy user. You can instead just learn how to do the same thing in ChatGPT or Bing Chat yourself. And we'll show some examples of that in a moment. Here's just an example of using the Bing image creator. Where I live, they have a yearly strawberry festival, so I asked it to create an image of a strawberry professor teaching a lecture. And anytime you give a text prompt like this, describing what kind of image you want to generate, it generates 4 images by default. Most of these tools do. And so you can pick which ones you like or whatever. As you can see, many of these tools still have problems with text or numbers in the images. Some still have problems with hands or faces. The new version of Midjourney version 5 is much better at that, but again, you have to pay to access that. This is what the Bing image generator looks like. You can type the query up here. I typed robot typing photorealistic. So you can describe characteristics of the image or painting, whatever you want. Like photorealistic means it looks like a photo. If I instead said create a painting of a robot typing in the style Picasso, you can see it generates images like that. So you can generate whatever you like in your prompts. So, but again, we'll mainly focus on text generation. ChatGPT, right now, it's the fastest adopted consumer app in history. Um, Facebook and Twitter took 5 years to reach 100 million users. TikTok took 9 months to reach that level. ChatGPT only took 2 months. Um, the only issue, though, is because it was so popular, a lot of times the site was down. Like even when I tried logging into the site before this recording, it wouldn't let me log in because the servers were too busy, and they started putting restrictions to reduce the load. Then the other thing that happened is recently they released a new version. The first version that came out was 3.5. Now they have version 4, which is much better, but they started charging for it, at least at the moment, 20 bucks a month. The good news though is that if you use Bing Chat, which is by Microsoft, they partnered with OpenAI, the company that made ChatGPT, so you can access the new version GPT-4 with Bing Chat, and it looks like this. It's the same thing where you can type in anything you want down here, a question that you want to answer, do you ask it to write something or more information about something, or ask for a recipe or create a poem. One difference between Bing Chat and ChatGPT is there's these three conversation styles you can toggle between. It starts with a balanced mode, but pretty much everyone I see, they recommend the creative mode. It's more flexible and to use. Unless you want to ask questions that require precise data or numbers, then you might want to switch to precise mode. So here, for example, I asked it to generate 3 ideas for a real-world activity that college students could do to apply their understanding of the psychology of persuasion. I did an activity like that a couple of years ago that I'll describe in a minute, and it talked first a little bit about the 6 principles of persuasion. Then for each of the 6 principles, it generated an idea for a possible activity students could do. So it didn't generate 3 ideas like I asked, but it's still, it's a nice thing it did. So we'll come back to that in a minute. So again, Bing Chat might be the best free option. I should mention though, right now they are requiring you to use the Microsoft Edge browser to access it or the Bing app. It also requires registering for a free personal Microsoft.com account. When I tried logging in with my school account, it wasn't allowed. Maybe my school hasn't enabled that yet, or I don't know if Microsoft hasn't enabled connections to school accounts yet. The other thing that happened to me, and so it may happen to you, is when I did finally, sign in with my personal account, it asked, do you want to link your personal Microsoft account with your school account? I, of course, said no several times, but every time I said no, it would just go to a white, empty page. Since I don't even use my personal Microsoft account for anything, I eventually just said yes, and then it started working. So just be aware of that. Again, if that's an issue too, there's alternatives you can try to like the ChatGPT. I do recommend, since if you do have to use the Edge browser to access it, maybe I wouldn't recommend that as your default browser. It basically tracks every single thing you do in the browser, everything you type. But anyways, it's based on the Chrome or Chromium browser engine though, so it's still a good browser. Just it doesn't have some of the privacy controls that you may have in another browser like Firefox. Okay, before I get into educational examples of using these tools, here's a sort of real world example. It just got my attention back in December. This is a high school student. I'm sorry, I forgot his name, but I'm not going to play this video, but he shows how he went to ChatGPT to ask it to generate a 1,500-word script about a certain topic. Then he went to a different tool where he pasted that script and it generated a video. Because again, there are video generation tools coming out now too, a video that used that script. And then another tool, he pasted the script and it generated a virtual avatar that lip synced to the script. He then combined those 2 videos into one and uploaded it to YouTube to monetize it with ads. Here's another less serious example, but this was probably the first time I noticed ChatGPT a couple days after it came out at the end of November. This is someone on Twitter. They shared an example of asking ChatGPT to write a biblical verse in the style of the Bible, explaining how to remove a peanut butter sandwich from a VCR. So it's kind of a funny example, but I just share it because it also illustrates how creative its responses can be. This isn't some answer that is pulling from a database, or it's not searching the web. It's generating it, trying to complete your prompt or your question or text that you wrote to try to figure out through its underlying large language model what is the most likely type of response that sounds right to your prompt. And we'll get more into that a little bit later too. Here's on the other end of the spectrum, a more practical example. At our school, to meet our quality standards, the videos need to have not just captions, but 100% accurate captions, including even punctuation. And so if someone wants to link or use a YouTube video, this is what the default captions look like. The automatically generated captions, you notice it has no punctuation and some errors. And usually to fix these transcripts, we'd have to copy and paste this into say a Word document and manually fix the whole transcript, adding the punctuation and so on. Very tedious. So instead, based on a tip I saw, I went to ChatGPT and later Bing Chat and prompted it, say, do not change the words of the following transcript, but add in that missing punctuation or fix misspelled words or whatever you want it to do. And it did a pretty good job. It added in the punctuation. It's a much better looking transcript. There were still some minor errors, but if they're minor errors, sometimes you can even ask ChatGPT to follow up and make those corrections too. It's like a chat bot. You can have a multiple prompts and it will remember what its previous responses in your previous prompts. Another practical example is this from an article by some nurses who explored uses for ChatGPT that this tool might help list and summarize patient information or generate case summaries or suggest conversation cues between nurses and patients, translate medical complex terminology into easier to understand text, and so on. But now let's get into the educational applications and examples of ChatGPT and similar tools. The main thing that ChatGPT has been making the headlines about and with respect to education is that it can pass many, if not most, of the standardized exams out there, like the SAT. It can even pass the medical license exam. ChatGPT, the original version 3.5, failed the bar exam, but the new version 4, it not only passed the bar exam, but it got in like I think the top 10%, and it can pass most of the AP exams and so on. Another most common example when people think of ChatGPT in education is a lot of instructors and so on are worried about students perhaps using ChatGPT to generate their writing, either for papers or even for discussion posts. So I took an assignment from a composition class that asked students to choose an essay from a list and then write a commentary and asked ChatGPT to do that, and it did. So this is my number one tip for you is to try these tools like Bing Chat yourself, submit, some of your assessments or assignment prompts to it and get familiar with the type of responses it generates. You'll notice there's a default writing style. It's usually a very neutral or positive tone. The sentences tend to be longer, and of course, the spelling and punctuation is perfect. Sometimes it will generate incorrect information and fake references. We'll get more to that in a bit too. But just get familiar with it so that if a student is using it, you can maybe recognize it. Of course, I'm not a composition instructor, but I imagine too, if you are familiar or if you have other samples of a student's writing, if they suddenly submit something generated by one of these tools, it's the same as if they generate something that was plagiarized, you'd probably notice that the writing style is suddenly very different. There are some other sample essays in the bottom link of this slide. One other little thing is this is with the old version of ChatGPT. I tried it in Bing Chat, which is the new version, with this prompt, and it refused to generate their essay for me. It would generate an outline for the essay, or it would identify the themes from the article, but it wouldn't write the essay for me. So I initially thought, hey, this is a good thing. Maybe it can, is being a little bit more resistant to answer if um, the prompt kind of correlates with an academic type of task. But then thinking more about it, I just thought, well, why don't I change the prompt to something that sounds a little less academic? So I instead asked it to draft a post, basically commenting on that essay, and then immediately spit it out. So it's very easy to get around some of the filters or so on these tools, and we'll get more into that in a bit too. So that's one thing for you to think about with these tools is how might you possibly redesign your assignments or assessments to either be maybe more resistant to students' use of AI tools to do their work on the assignment or assessment, or maybe embrace these tools. And we'll follow up more about this a little bit later. And again, I want to start with some positive uses, though, of using these tools, some things that might be helpful mainly to instructors, but also to students. And just to start out with, I asked ChatGPT, what are some ways in which uh, that tool can support students or support instructors? And on the left are some ideas for how it can support students, and on the right are instructors. It might help students with study tips or tutoring and coaching, and I'll come back to that in a bit. And one thing I'm exploring this summer is perhaps providing career guidance for students. For instructors, it can help with instructional design support or sharing information about pedagogical techniques. It can even help with grading and so on. I added a slide about that. That's, of course, an ethical gray area, but we'll talk about that in a bit too. Okay, let's go through some examples that you might find helpful if you're an instructor for using these tools that might save you some time or give you some initial ideas for things. There are some guides out there already for instructors on using these tools. I've linked to them in the handout. You'll find a bunch of different ideas. But to start with a basic example, you can prompt it to generate a multiple choice question or multiple questions assessing a certain concept, for example. ChatGPT, it not only generates the question, but it explains the different answers. That is a very low level example, though, just involving memorization. Here's a higher order example where I asked it to generate some discussion questions about a particular topic. And as I mentioned before, I asked Bing Chat to generate some real world activity ideas about a certain concept. Some other examples have been shared by Ethan Mollick, an economics professor. And the slide, I have a link to this article with these examples, but you can ask it to generate examples to share with students, generate explanations of concepts for students, again, generating low stakes quiz questions. This one I liked. A service I often do is surveying students about, what do they like about the class so far, or what suggestions do they have for improving the class. You can do this yourself in your class with a minute paper or a muddiest point activity. That's where you might ask students, what concept in this week's lesson did you find most confusing or so on. Then you can copy all their responses and paste them into Bing Chat and ask it to summarize their responses, like what were the top 3 areas they were confused in or so on. This is an example my co-presenter Eileen Frank came up with. If you are looking at ways to integrate ChatGPT or similar tools into your class, you can ask it to generate perhaps a handout that has some guidance for students, like pros and cons about using the tool. It mentions some pros about it can help students save time or help them with language. For example, maybe English isn't their first language, or maybe they're have or still struggling with the writing or so on. There are some cons. It mentions the plagiarism risk and being overly dependent on it, instead of developing your own writing skills. And there's some other, limitations we'll get into in a minute. The other recommendation we have is that you consider adding a policy statement, perhaps to your syllabus, and also discussing the use of ChatGPT and similar tools in your class, even if you want to ban the tool or try to ban. It's becoming so ubiquitous. It's pretty much impossible to ban now. These tools are going to be incorporated in all these other tools that we use every day, like all the Microsoft apps, all the Google apps, and so on. But in addition to generating or creating a policy statement, you might want to have a discussion with your students about these tools, and we'll come back to that in a little bit too. But this is where I asked ChatGPT to generate a class policy statement that tried to encourage students to use these tools ethically, like properly cite it. But again, if you do want to generate policy where you want to discourage students from using these tools, here's an example that ChatGPT shared too. Although it's, again, a little ironic to use ChatGPT to ban ChatGPT, but hey, it can do it. And in the handout in here, I have a link to a Google Doc that Lance Eaton has compiled of several different classroom policies that might give you another starting point. A couple of slides I added after our workshop based on some new things that have come out is there's some uh, new examples of using ChatGPT and similar tools as a tutor or as a coach or as an advisor. The Khan Academy is coming out with a new free app that will act as a tutor or Socratic style tutor. I've seen articles and I put some in the notes on these slides, like using it for self-coaching or career coaching. That stuff I'll be exploring more in the summer to see how it might be useful in a college success class in the fall. And yes, some recent articles and videos. And again, I have several that I found in the notes here. There's some examples of instructors using it to assist with their grading. And again, that's an ethical gray area, but you could ask it to generate a rubric for a particular topic. There's nothing ethically wrong with that, but might be a starting point. But it can do actual grading too. Like you can paste a student essay or something and ask it to give feedback on it. Again, I would just be cautious about that because we don't know how these companies or vendors are using the data they're collecting when you're typing in these prompts or sharing this information. ChatGPT was using the data you submit to use in its retraining of its models, but they uh, announced they were stopping that. But there still may be other ways they're using the data, like just collecting it for ads. Bing Chat will almost certainly start incorporating, whoops, here it is, ads in the future. And they might even potentially sell information they collect, just like other vendors and companies do. So check out some of those resources, though. It may save you some time with some of the grading or assessment tasks. Another big recommendation is to learn more about prompting, writing and creating these prompts. The more detailed your prompts are, the better control and better quality you have in the responses that you can get from these tools, including the image generation tools. There are some guides out there like this one that I've linked to from the slide and in the handout. And there are starting to emerge some guides about uh, the sort of characteristics of good prompts. Like one characteristic too is to tell ChatGPT what role it should take or what perspective it should take. Like, is it a college composition instructor or is it a college student or so on. This is just one framework that um, a person who goes by the handle ICT Evangelist, forgive me, I think his first name's Steve, I'm forgetting his last name, has shared, but there's several other kind of prompt engineering guides that have coming out. I put links to some in the handout and here to learn more about this. Is becoming sort of like a new skill or even a literacy for folks in using these tools. So there's even some jobs being advertised for prompt engineers. So let's switch now to some of the issues and limitations with these AI generator tools. And this is a rapidly changing thing because the vendors and creators of these tools are aware of these limitations too, and they're working hard on them, and some they're making progress on, and some they may make some progress on, but they may likely never truly get rid of. These tools currently, the text generators, are not very good with reasoning or logic. Uh, so they're not actually thinking when they're generating their answers. It's basically just acting like autocomplete and looking at comment, what is sort of the type of response that it seems most likely to your prompt, not necessarily what's the correct response or the logical response. A huge issue is these tools are generating fake references and fake information. I'll revisit that in a minute. This is an example here where this was a serious limitation with these tools, but they're working very hard on this. These tools are also not very good at math and quantitative kind of answers like that, but they're already is in the new version of ChatGPT. They are now have plugins, so whenever you ask a math-related question, it can forward your question to Wolfram Alpha, which is better suited for those kind of questions. Google apparently has already integrated Google Palm, a math-solving kind of model, with its Google Bard AI tool. So I haven't tried it out itself, but apparently it might be better with math questions now. Microsoft released a paper about a tool called Math Prompter, but they haven't released it yet. Then this other limitation is already becoming less relevant too. Before, these tools have to be trained on large sets of data, pretty much any text they can get off the internet, and so they have to take a snapshot basically of that text. And the original version released of ChatGPT 3.5 was only trained on information from the internet up to, I think, 2020. So if you asked a question about something that was newer, like a current event, it wouldn't know anything about it. But the new tools now are searching the web live, so they can start to be able to answer questions about current events or recent events. So let's go through some of these issues a little bit more. Again, probably one of the big issues instructors are concerned about is the use of these tools for plagiarism or cheating. Again, remember that assignment I mentioned before where I asked the tool to write an essay for me. There are tools that you can use as an instructor to possibly check if there's a chance something submitted by your student was generated by one of these AI tools. but there's some serious caveats. But first, let me just kind of go through a little bit about how they work. GPT-0.me is just one of these tools. It's free. There are several others that are free too, including one released by OpenAI itself. This is an example where I submitted that essay it generated to this tool, and it did say that it was likely that it's generated by AI. It's guessing about that by sort of looking at the text and seeing how predictable basically is the text. That's what it's using, these terms perplexity and burstiness. How surprising is the text? And if it's less surprising or less predictable, it guesses that it may have been generated by AI. Turnitin, which many schools use for checking for plagiarism, they've also now added an AI detector. Um, they will start charging for that edition at January of next year. But so remember, there are several free alternatives. This is an example where I submitted my own paragraph to it, and it instead uh, guessed that it was generated by me, by a human, and it was correct in that case. But again, there are some serious issues to be aware of with these AI detectors, which is why I'd recommend using them sparingly and definitely not relying on them as a sole source for accusing a student of cheating. First of all, there's a significant false positive rate. That's um, uh, forgive me, it's when you don't, what the worst case scenario is when you falsely accuse a student of cheating on something they wrote when they didn't. And unfortunately, the percentage of cases where that happens is still too high with these tools. Um, with the older plagiarism detection, it has a minuscule, false rate, and also it has links to verify how the student plagiarized. But with this AI detectors, it's basically just guessing. So you can't really rely on it as a sole source for accusing a student or something like that. Also, these AI detectors are very easy to beat. A student could just make minor changes to what was generated to beat the AI detector, or you can even ask the ChatGPT or the similar tool to generate the essay in a style that is less detectable by these AI detectors. And again, like I mentioned before, there's student privacy issues. If you're using these AI detectors and you're submitting student work to them, what are these companies doing with that student data that you're submitting? Are they storing it? Are they, using it for advertising or selling the data? Who knows? So just use it as sparingly as possible is my recommendation. I'm going to kind of skip this slide, but this goes into a little bit more of the math that with these high false positive rates, these tools aren't very good at catching the people who are cheating, and worse, they're flagging innocent people regularly. So another issue with these generator tools is what some call hallucinations. Basically, it's generating fake information. I'm not going to go into details of this here, but I have a link here to a Twitter thread by David Smearden who kind of explains why is it generating these fake references and other fake information. He shared an example where he asked ChatGPT, what is the most cited economics paper of all time? And the answer that was given was a completely fake paper. So he went through a thread of explaining why did it generate this fake paper? How did it come up with the title of this fake article, or why did it connect these two authors who've never published together, and so on. It's basically, again, it's sort of acting like autocomplete. It's trying to make a predictions on what the answer is most likely to be based on its training data. Like I mentioned before, there's some copyright and legal issues, especially with the image generation tools. Again, they're working on that now too. Adobe Firefly doesn't have that issue, for example, now. Um, with the text that's being generated, I don't know if the text generators might have some legal issues come out too. I'm sorry, there are already some legal issues with the fake information. Sometimes it's generating fake information about real people and accusing them of a crime they didn't commit and so on. There's some lawsuits related to that. Another serious issue of these tools, and this is why we only in this past year have seen these tools emerge, is they generate based on their training data, they can generate harmful or biased information. Um, about 7 years ago, in 2016, there was an AI chatbot released by Microsoft called Microsoft Tay, Tay. You can Google that for that story, but they connected it to Twitter, and very quickly people were able to get the chatbot to generate harmful and biased content, instructions on how to build a bomb or so on. So within a day, they shut it down. So that's why for the next 7 years, no one released another AI chatbot because of this issue. So they started uh, developing ways to add filters, extra training, like um, human feedback training to kind of suppress the generation of harmful biased content. It's not basically working perfectly though. It still can do this, and a lot of people are finding ways to get around these filters to get ChatGPT and similar tools to again generate unfiltered responses, you might say. I've already talked about some of the student privacy issues and some ethical issues, but one issue too is again that these tools were trained on text from all over the internet, from social media. So it was trained on that harmful and biased information. So hopefully we can see some new tools emerging where it's trained on, information that's more accurate or less biased. That's never going to be eliminated, though, of course. There are some tools already coming out that let you submit your own documents for it to be trained on. It can answer questions about documents or other information that you submit. Right now, those tools require some technical expertise to use, but again, this is a rapidly changing situation. The last issue I'll mention, and this is, I think, a really important information that you might want to discuss with your students, is just a little bit about how these tools work and how they don't work. In the movies, we have these examples of AI that can think like a human and do human things, or so on. There's data from Star Trek and so on, but these AI generator tools don't work like that. They're not general artificial intelligence tools. They don't think or reason like people. They don't actually understand any of the text it's generating or the text that you're submitting. Again, they're acting more like autocomplete. If you want to dive a little bit more into this kind of issue, you can Google the phrase stochastic parrot and to see some other information. I have some links in the handout too on critical AI information that kind of discusses more of the limitations and some serious issues with some of these tools to be aware of if you're using them. Again, your students, they need to know also these tools quite frequently will generate fake information, so they need to employ their critical thinking to evaluate and verify any information that it generates if you do, are letting them use them ethically. So there's all these serious issues with these tools, but are there some situations where it is sort of safer, you might say, to use it? One is if the information you want to generate doesn't need to be verified, like if you're actually asking it to generate a poem or a fictional thing. Uh, but if you do need non-fictional information to be generated, can you verify its response and so on? So this is a flow chart Eileen found that kind of walks through that by Alexander Tukunov. And I also have a link to an article that also kind of covers this area. So let's go now to 5 strategies or 5 types of strategies for adapting your assessments or assignments to the use and existence of these AI generator tools. And these are roughly ordered by the amount of work or the amount of change required to your assessments or assignments. The first two might even require no changes to your assignments. I'm actually going to go back to the handout though, because it has a little bit more details. The first strategy is where you're just trying to prevent maybe or check for AI generated work. Again, like I mentioned in that composition essay example, most likely if a student submits work that was generated by an AI tool, you'll probably be able to tell because it's suddenly a different writing style. Suddenly the writing is all long sentences and perfect, grammar and spelling, and this encyclopedic type of neutral or positive tone. But again, I do recommend you submit your assignments or prompts to these tools to kind of get familiar with its responses. Turnitin has released a sample rubric that you might use called the AI misuse rubric that will also give you some ideas for tailoring your assignments to be more resistant to AI. Again, that's just one perspective, being resistant. The other side is being more embracing, that we'll get to in a minute. And again, as I mentioned before, there are tools for checking for AI generated text, but uh, they're not, definitive proof that it was generated. It's just basically a guess, and so they're not always reliable. There's false positive rates. They're very easy to beat, and there's the student privacy issue. Turnitin has also released, I'm sorry, not Turnitin, Packback has released some guidance on what to do if you do suspect that a student has submitted AI generated text. some ideas there. The second strategy is when you're teaching face-to-face, or perhaps you're teaching synchronously in Zoom or Microsoft Teams. Any work students are doing in a synchronous or face-to-face session, obviously there's probably very little chance that you're using AI then because they're right there in front of you. There's one strategy you might check out, two-stage exams where students first take an exam individually, then they get into groups and work together. That can help the students who maybe struggled on the exam to learn from each other. Some people have suggested oral exams, but that's very time consuming, to let every single student do an oral exam. That leads to the third strategy. This may involve a little bit more work, but this is where you assess the process, not just the end product of the student work. If students use Google Docs or the browser version of Word, it keeps track of the editing history of the docs. So if you suspect something, for example, you could look at the editing history of the document and see, did the student suddenly paste a large chunk of text or something like that. There are also video tools. Microsoft Flip, or formerly Flipgrid, is a video discussion board. And I've seen, for example, examples of math instructors asking students to submit a video explaining how they solved the math problem, for example, or you can ask them to reflect on something they wrote or so on. And your learning management system like Canvas or whatever probably has a video product that they can use as well. That's also a possible option for oral, exams. They could record their oral exam too, but again, you're going to have to watch all of them. It's going to take a lot more time. The fourth strategy, this involves really rethinking or redesigning your assignments using some evidence-based practices that have been shown to, it will not only make it perhaps less resistant or perhaps embracing of AI, but also they've been shown to improve student learning and engagement in courses. These are ideas like authentic assessment or alternative assessment, where you kind of incorporate real world activities for your assessments instead of the standard textbook type multiple choice questions or so on, or essays. That's like I showed earlier in Bing Chat. I asked it to generate some ideas for a real world activity for students to apply their understanding of the psychology of persuasion. A couple of years ago, when I was teaching an online psychology class, I had students create posters or flyers to help persuade their fellow students to follow COVID safety procedures, for example. So that's a more authentic type of assessment activity. And in the handout, I have links to several sites that have examples of other authentic assessment activities from different types of classes, as well as open pedagogy type examples that are similar, but involve students creating openly licensed materials, maybe a textbook, or again, like I mentioned, the flyers or whatever it might be. And lastly, another evidence-based practice is peer assessment, where students kind of critique each other. This is a link to a guide on that. You have to be careful about some of these evidence-based practices like peer assessment. You have to uh, you know, kind of train students how to do peer assessment so they aren't being harsh with each other and so on. And lastly is the strategy of embracing these tools, these AI tools. One rule of thumb I have if I'm trying to teach some concept or skill in a class is try to think about, how do people apply this concept or skill in the real world? And is there any way I can make it similar in my class? So if in the real world, to learn some skill or concept, would they be using an AI tool to help them accomplish their task? And if so, maybe it might be appropriate to let students use AI tools in your class as well. And again, I'm not going too much into that in this video, but there's some links to some guides that have many, many different ideas about how to embrace the use of these tools in your course. So just to go back, again, think of an assignment or assessment from your own class. And here I'm bringing up that essay composition assignment again, and how would you revise it to either be more resistant to AI tools or, again, embracing these tools? This is where in the live workshop I'd pause and we'd kind of discuss this issue some, but so if you want to think about it for one of your own assignments or for that essay, what ideas do you have for maybe redesigning or revising that assignment to perhaps resist the unethical use of these tools, or embrace the use of these tools in more ethical and appropriate ways? So some ideas for making it more AI resistant that I initially came up with. Unfortunately, some of these ideas may no longer work so well. And I remember the earlier trick was to maybe make your assignment refer to newer stuff like recent events, and those tools wouldn't have answers for them. But again, new versions of these tools are searching the web and can answer questions about recent events or stuff in the news. The second strategy, and right now this still can work, is to ask students to incorporate references and citations and quotes in their essays or whatever they're writing. Because again, these tools are not that great at that. They generate fake references. Of course, you would have to verify the references are accurate, or ask the students to somehow maybe link to the original reference or something like that to verify that the references in their papers are accurate. There are some new tools for researchers like perplexity.ai or elicit.org that do ensure that the references it generates are accurate. And again, the vendors of ChatGPT and similar tools are aware of this issue too, and they're working on that. Bing Chat, for example, it will search the internet to find more accurate references when it's giving responses, but it still isn't perfect. The third strategy, this has been my main go-to strategy, is to ask students to incorporate, personal reflections or so on in their responses to your assignments or so on. Uh, and so I thought that made, for example, my college success class kind of resistant. I thought I didn't really have to worry about students cheating because all my assignments are personal and so on. And I still am not really worried about it, but thinking about it more technically, a student could still use these AI tools to cheat on assignments involving personal reflections if they shared, probably not the best idea, but if they shared their personal information with the tools. Like if, say, a student said, "Hey, I'm a first generation college student studying to be a nurse," and shared some personal information like that, and then asked it to generate a response. So it's possible. Uh, the other, again, type of philosophy or whatever of adapting your assignments is try to embrace these tools. And again, I already mentioned the handout has links to guides, but there's some ideas here like asking ChatGPT to generate feedback on the student's essay, and or asking students to compare their essay with one generated by ChatGPT, or share what ChatGPT generated and asking students to annotate it or comment on it, and so on. This is near the end. I do in the handout have some do's and don'ts in the second page of the handout. I'm not going to go through it now, I'll just let you go through it. It kind of summarizes a lot of the same stuff I've already gone through. Again, but some of the main recommendations are try these tools yourself to get familiar with them. I wouldn't rely solely on AI detectors. Discuss these tools with your students and even add a policy to your syllabus. And again, don't be scammed. Some of those third-party tools, they want your money, but really they're just thin wrappers on top of ChatGPT and similar tools. So you might be able to do the same thing without having to pay. So the last section is I just wanted to try to share some possible ideas about future trends in these tools. Some of these future trends are already happening now. Again, we're seeing AI become embedded in all these other tools. All the Microsoft tools are going to have AI embedded, the Google tools, Adobe, and so on. These AI tools are becoming more multimodal. Bing Chat can already generate text and images at the same time, actually. So you don't necessarily have to use Bing Image Generator, but I still find it easier that way. And as I mentioned before, there are tools emerging where you can submit your own documents or data, and it can be trained on that and answer questions about your own documents that you submit. I'm also keeping a close eye on open source alternatives that you can download and install or run on other sites, so you don't have some of the ethical or privacy issues. And again, you can customize them more. Some even run locally on your own computer. I have links to some in the handout, but this is a rapidly evolving and changing situation. Look for more lawsuits and legal issues emerging from the use of these tools. You'll start to see more AI-generated content online, including videos, spam content. We'll likely see more innovative and interesting applications of these tools. I've already shared some examples of using it for self-help or coaching. Um, there is some speculation about are any jobs being threatened by these tools. Um, some might be threatened, or you might see some jobs kind of be diminished in the number of people working them. But right now, I'm not really worried about instructors' jobs. But who knows? We'll see. And there's some new literacies and skills emerging by the emergence and ubiquity of these tools. Again, I mentioned prompt engineering, and again, I think it's that students need to learn how to better understand these tools and be critical about the information and resources they generate, about fake references or copyright issues and so on. So that's pretty much it for this session. I hope you found it useful. Again, you have the link to the handout and the slides is at bit.ly/ teach ChatGPT. That's the handout and also the LibGuide that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Again, hope you found it useful, and feel free to share your own ideas for how you're thinking about using these tools or how you're adapting your assessments and assignments in your classes. Thank you.